Welcome to Young Adults Learning Evil, hosted by Nyrule. Young Adults Learning Evil is a gritty documentary podcast that explores the intersectionality of class, wealth, and race, and how it has played out over the past 400 years within a community. The podcast gives the world insight into how urban trauma affects a marginalized Black community inside one of America's first planned cities, New Haven, Connecticut. New Haven is also the home of one of the world's most prestigious and powerful institutions, Yale University. Subscribe to Young Adults Learning Evil on your favorite podcast platform. Here is your host, Nyrule.
Peace, this is Nyrule, and you are listening to Young Adults Learning Evil. In this episode, I will discuss the education of African hostages and freedmen, the historical challenges, and the adversaries to having an educated Black population in the city. The Black mind at the beginning of the 1800s was becoming more focused on self-determination due to the newly found freedom of African hostages since the ending of the Revolutionary War. The Somerset Act also was a big contributor because it ended British slavery inside of its colonies. So there was an influx of freed West Indian immigrants that came to the Americas, and many have settled in the New Haven area. In 1890, a New Haven resident who was being held hostage by the Yale graduate Eli Whitney named Black Sam. He created an invention based off a tool that his father made to make it easier to separate the cotton from the rest of the debris. Eli Whitney saw the efficiency in this invention, and he mechanized it so that it could be mass-produced. This invention changed America. The colonies only held 250,000 hostages at the end of the Revolutionary War. Due to the invention of the cotton gin, the global demand of cotton exploded the demand for hostages in America. And by the beginning of the Civil War, there were more than 4 million African hostages and freedmen inside of America. Now, simultaneously in 1790, France and her colonies were going through a cultural revolution. The French Revolution started in the streets of France in 1789. This caused a division between the Loyalists and the planters on the island of Haiti, who teamed up with the mulatto class to expel the Loyalists to the king from the island. The free Africans and the hostages learned that the white slaves in France were killing their masters in the streets of France, and now was their turn to seize power. Utilizing African spiritual traditions, the African population took up the first successful slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere, spearheaded by sovereign Maroons who lived in encampments of escaped hostages. They were able to create networks that expanded across the entire island into the city and towns. The Haitian Revolution lasted over a decade. They were able to defeat Napoleon's army and gain independence. The symbolism was powerful, even though it was a Pyrrhic victory. These two events, at the beginning of the century, set the tone and direction for the next century. The more knowledge African hostages and freedmen obtained, the more likely they would demand their freedom. New Haven was not immune to this. The Black governorship allowed Blacks in Connecticut a level of sovereignty by proxy. But even though they were under white oppression, the Black governorship and segregation gave them a sense of autonomy, as opposed to the South, whose African hostage population exploded and the planters brutally oppressed them and were bound by an honor code of violence that they had to adapt to in order to survive. New Haven, being home to Yale University, had a long history of offering educational opportunities for its white residents. John Davenport had plans of creating a grammar school for the families in the city. As early as 1650, New Haven had established a public school for its white residents. It didn't become successful until the state sold its western territory and created a public school fund. African hostages and freedmen were not considered for instructions. After the Revolutionary War and the Gradual Manumission Act, the black population had to become educated because they were no longer bonded to a human trafficker. This brought the demand for educational opportunities for the free black men and women in New Haven. The first school of African Americans was established in 1811. One of the first instructors of the school was Jacob Olson. Little is known about his early life, but what is known is that he is of West Indian descent and came to New Haven around 1805. As an instructor at the school, Jacob Olson became known as a knowledgeable but strict educator. Jacob Olson was also a contemporary of William Lansing. During a time when the city's black population started to gain more runaway hostages from the South, Lansing and Olson provided opportunities for them to integrate into New Haven society. Many of the white intellectuals in the city felt the solution to the influx of freed African hostages would be to not allow them into the greater society. Instead, train them to be Christians and send them to an African colony so they can spread the word of Christianity to the Africans and not be a burden on the American society. So they had their motives for educating the black population. Emancipated black intellectuals were having an identity crisis. After becoming literate, questions as to what it was to be a black person living in America became a topic of discussion. At a time when race started to become a social construct in the 17th and 18th century. As early as 1780, black founders began to create intellectual dialogue on race, as opposed to the dominant white culture's negative perspective on blackness. Their thoughts on autonomy and freedom were also discussed. Many started to look to Africa for their identity. Some even strived to make communities in Africa based on commerce and religious service. Jacob Olson solidified his place in history with his writings on this topic. In 1818, Olson published his famous writing titled A Search for Truth. In the writing, Olson explored the origins of the black race from a biblical lens as well as a historical lens. Through biblical texts, he used the stories to show that humanity has a common origin as opposed to Ezra Stiles, who used the biblical stories to dehumanize. Jacob's historical view on African history was also revolutionary. He showed the historical fact that Africa was the cradle of Western civilization. Even in that era, he knew that Egypt was an African country that was responsible for Greek's enlightenment. He also highlighted that Black Nubia as a seat of the education in ancient Africa, and the many African bishops that led the early Christian church. He also took up issue with the name Negro, arguing that it did not connect black people to their ancestral home, thus coining the term African American. This statement by Jacob Olson sums everything up. Had the Christian nations been as ambitious to train up our minds to religion and piety as they were to enslave and live upon their ill-gotten wealth by injustice and cruelty, our minds would have never been as degraded as they are represented to be. He likened the African community to a caged lion, with his statement, "Let His Majesty the lion be unbound, and he will resume his former prerogative. So let us be emancipated from our encumbrances, and then, where our ignorance and darkness reigns, religion and true science would be abound." Jacob Olson would make this speech for the citizens of New Haven, whose black community was rapidly growing, and enterprising free black men like William Lansing, Bias Stanley, and Scipio Augustus took his words to heart. Jacob Olson also addressed one of the founders and bishops of the African Methodist Episcopalian Zion Church, Christopher Rush, who led one of the largest black organizations in the country. The New Haven educators' impact on African American history cannot be overstated, and it had an immense impact on the debate about education, slavery, and colonization. As mentioned earlier, The black founders saw repatriation to Africa as a possible future for Africans in America. And as early as 1773, with the creation of the British colony Sierra Leone, free blacks started to repatriate back to Africa. After Haiti gained independence, more free Africans in America saw repatriation as a means of becoming autonomous. In Boston, a black man named Paul Cuffey ventured to Africa multiple times with other Africans in America to see the prospects of Sierra Leone. Paul asked for support from both the British and United States government, but died shortly after his last voyage in 1817. But before Cuffey passed, he made it known that the American Colonization Society was not positive by chairing public meetings to denounce the organization. Now, simultaneously, there was a faction of white abolitionists that created the American Colonization Society. Their motive for colonization was their willingness to not live up to the Declaration of Independence, stating that all men were created equal. They didn't like the institution of slavery, but they held sharing power and resources with former hostages with the same disdain. Integration was not an option that they even wanted to entertain. The white clergy seen colonization as a way to spread Western ideas and Christianity into Africa, using the former hostages as their proxies. As a response to the slave revolts, Congress, after hearing about Paul Cuffey, floated sending the black population to either the West African coast or into the territories of the Pacific Northwest. From this congressional debate, the American Colonization Society was born, led by Henry Clay. New Haven's intellectual elite embraced the American Colonization Society. Many prominent Yale figures embraced this movement. Tahuti Ashman, who has a street named after him and is currently buried in the Grove Street Cemetery, was an earlier supporter of the movement. He published the first newsletter and helped found Liberia in 1922. There, he was a leader in setting up the colony. They acquired the land by using the same savage tactics as they did in America. Like his predecessor, the Lieutenant Robert Stockton, who in 1821 persuaded the African king Zoluduma, or King Peter, to sell Cape Montserrado. He convinced him by pointing a pistol at his head. Ashman was prepared to use force to extend the colony's territory. He acquired land along the rivers in the ocean front. In his treaty of May 1825 with Zoluduma and other native kings, they agreed to sell the land in return for 500 bars of tobacco, 3 barrels of rum, 5 casks of gunpowder, and 5 umbrellas, 10 iron pots, and 10 pairs of shoes, among other items. He knew that the African Americans needed to be educated in Western ethics in order to extend the American empire into Africa, and to bring his vision of the colony into fruition. In New Haven, his fellow Yale alum Leonard Bacon, who was currently the pastor of New Haven Center Church, took up the task of educating the prospective migrants so they can be proxies of the American white power structure. He felt that in order for the colony to be successful, there needed to be trained clergymen and government agents. Leonard Bacon knew that in order for the American Colonization Society to be accepted, there needed to be 3 agreements. The first one was to have the black population approve of colonizing and relocating to Africa. The next group that needed to be in agreement was the American government, because in order for it to be successful, the black population needed to be educated previously before entering the new colony. And that would take funding, and he needed the government's assistance in doing so. Also, assistance in setting up the infrastructure in the Liberia colony. The last group was the Southern planters. They had to convince them that once they free their slaves, that they will be shipped to Africa, so they won't be threatened by a free population. The Southern planters rejected the American Colonization Society proposal, and they banned them from gathering in the South. Many of the black populations above the Potomac were opposed to the notion also. Being shipped to Africa means you were separated from your family and you're not able to participate in the America that they built. The only ones that pushed the issue were the white northern intellectual elite. They had a hidden agenda to strengthen slavery by getting rid of the free black population. So abolition wasn't their goal. Their main goal was to get rid of the free black population so that they don't threaten the power structure within the country. So in New Haven, Bacon, along with fellow Yale alumni and abolitionists Simeon Jocelyn, partnered with the black leadership in New Haven, like William Lansing, Bias Stanley, and Scipio Augustus, to form the African United Ecclesiastical Society and the African Improvement Society. These societies were created in cities in the Northeast to provide a basic free education for free blacks and hostages to instill useful virtues such as piety, frugality, and work ethic. In collaboration with the black community and white sympathizers, New Haven's Improvement Society organized schools, a library, savings banks for the black population, and the creation of New Haven's first black church, the Temple Street Church, which was led by Simeon Jocelyn. The Temple Street Church is now the Dixville Congregational Church and is still active to this day. The white savior mentality of the American Colonization Society clashed with the abolitionists. The white elite wanted to dictate what's best for the black community, regardless of the black community's own aspirations. This would create a conflict. The only reason why they were funding education for the blacks was not so they can participate in the American society, but so that they can be removed from America and serve as their agents in Africa, promoting their agenda, not their own. The black community in New Haven, with leadership inspired by the lofty words of Jacob Olson, rejected the American Colonization Society and created their own agenda. Higher education in Connecticut was very important, and to this day, New Haven is a college town with 5 colleges and universities in the immediate vicinity. By 1830, 1% of males in New England were college educated, and Connecticut had the highest college matriculation rate in the country per capita. Free Africans created a newspaper in 1827 called the Freedmen's Journal. It was used to circulate the ideas and agendas of the free black community in the North. The black community took full advantage of the educational opportunities, doubling the population in the schools and learning centers in New Haven. Establishing schools of higher learning became a priority. The American Colonization Society had a similar goal, just ulterior motives. The ideas of the freedmen in New Haven aligned with the rest of the population in the country. They wanted to create a college and trade school to train freed hostages so they can be positive contributions to the society, just like William Lansing was. Simeon Jocelyn, who represented the interests of the New Haven black community, and a freedman from New York named Peter Williams, consolidated their plans of creating a school to present the idea of a Negro college to the Second Negro Convention held in Philadelphia. The plan presented by Williams and Jocelyn was to create a college for freed hostages so they can have the same advantages that higher learning provides to white Americans. Williams was initially opposed to any white assistance in the endeavor, but Jocelyn's track record with the New Haven black community eased his suspicion. At the time, there were very few colleges admitting black students. These restrictions created the need for a black college that would connect agriculture, horticulture, mechanical arts, as well as the study of science and the humanities. A wealthy New Haven merchant philanthropist named Arthur Tappan, who had sponsored the tuition of over 100 Yale students and was the founding member of the African Education Society. He was a follower of the American Colonization Society, but his views eventually evolved to favor abolition. He donated land, buildings, and $1,000 to the endeavor. New Haven was seen as the perfect location for the college. It was close to New York and Boston. It had a large port, thanks to William Lansing, which made the transportation from the West Indies and other parts of the country more feasible, and it was already an intellectual hub. The city didn't have as much racial tension as New York and Boston, and it seemed like an ideal place for a black college. The college would produce an intellectual and industrial class of African Americans that would be perpetuated throughout their communities, creating wealth-building opportunities and participating in big industry. The black community had no interest in doing that in Africa. They felt ownership of America and were entitled to all of its amenities. This was contrary to the American Colonization Society, and people like Leonard Bacon became upset when known abolitionists started to promote the Black College Project. Peter Williams and Simeon Jocelyn presented their plan for the Black College to the Negro Convention in Philadelphia at the end of June 1831. The Negro Convention started in 1830 in Philadelphia, which at the time had one of the largest communities of free African Americans at that time. They launched the National Negro Convention to address the hostility, exclusion, discrimination, and violence against African Americans by whites in northern cities. The Connecticut delegate to the first convention was New Haven business owner Scipio Augustus. The convention gave Williams and Jocelyn an enthusiastic approval for the college, and prominent abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison and Benjamin Lundy, people that promoted universal emancipation, aided in the fundraising. After attending the Negro Convention in Philadelphia, Jocelyn was ready to present his plan to New Haven's Board of Aldermen so they can improve the land sale and establishment of the school. The date was set for the first week in September 1831. While the free African Americans in the North were exercising their freedoms, the majority of African Americans were still being held hostage and were experiencing the worst atrocities that you could imagine. Torture and violence was part of the daily life in the South, and the human traffickers tried their hardest to prevent their hostages to escape or to even be under the impression of equality. The few that escaped to the North were traumatized and dehumanized. The free blacks in the North wanted to end the practice and repair the damage that was done. They saw education as a way to do that. But the conditions being faced by African American hostages in the South needed immediate intervention. The only use for education in the South was to teach a hostage how to read the Bible so they could minister over the black population. They did not promote independence or self-determination. They just wanted indoctrination. So while black clergy in the North like Peter Williams were planning a college with white clergymen, a reverend from Southampton County, Virginia, felt divinely inspired to take another route in order to liberate African American hostages. The name of that reverend was Nat Turner. Born during the era of the Haitian Revolution, as a young child, he was seen as insightful and was chosen by his human trafficker that held him hostage for religious instructions that taught him how to read and how to write. He displayed religious devotion and piety and was trusted by both human traffickers and his hostages. He worked on several plantations. Once he escaped, only to return a month later. He cited a biblical passage for his return, and he said, "Return to the service of my earthly master, for he knoweth his master's will, and doeth it not, shall be beaten with many stripes, and thus have I chastened you." Nat Turner lost the respect of the African American hostages who felt that his devotion to that slave religion was detrimental to the community. He was sold to another plantation where he finally came into his own. He began to have religious visions that were inspiring him to liberate his people. And in February 1831, after experiencing a solar eclipse, Nat Turner saw that as a sign to go forward with his plans. The initial date for the revolution was the 4th of July to commemorate Independence Day, but it had to be postponed. So on August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner, with his co-conspirators, galvanized an army of at least 70 rebels, armed with axes, mallets, and muskets, with the mentality of get free or die trying. They went from farm to farm, annihilating as many white people as possible. The government militia was called in, and they had to use 3 extra units of artillery to squash the rebellion. The aftermath left about 60 white victims, and 53 rebels were later executed by the court. And there were countless innocent black people that were indiscriminately slaughtered by the militia and white citizens in the South as retaliation for Nat Turner's actions. News of the rebellion reached New Haven. The news report of the rebellion was right next to an ad giving New Haven residents notice of the Negro College planned for the city. The white residents interpreted that as their town will be the next scene of a rebellion. At the town meeting, City Hall was packed with angry white New Haven residents and Yaleys that wanted to show their disapproval of the plan to create an educational hub for Africans in America in their city. The vote was almost unanimous, 700-4 against the college. And that day, the city wrote this proclamation: resolved by the mayor, aldermen, common council, and freedmen of the city of New Haven, in a city meeting assembled, that we will resist the establishment of the proposed college in this place by every lawful means. And the unwritten part was by every unlawful means also, because the disapproval became violent. After voting down the plan for the black college, the white town and gown combined to wreak havoc on the black community and whites that they suspected of being in favor of abolition. With Nat Turner still a fugitive of the law at that time, their level of fear was reaching an apex. They went to William Lansing's neighborhood, New Liberia, and set fire to homes and beat up black and white residents. They went to Arthur Tappan's residence and threw stones at his house, causing considerable damage. They went to Spireworth in the Hill and tore down a house that was owned and housed black families. The violence went unreported in the newspaper because they were complacent with the violence. And a week before Nat Turner was captured, a newspaper in Vermont released this statement in regards to New Haven's reaction to the black college. The northern blacks must be bound to silence because slavery does not exist in Connecticut. Therefore, within the boundaries of Connecticut, it must not be spoken against because neither Connecticut nor Congress has any control over the laws of South Carolina. Therefore, the free people of color at the North must be doomed to perpetual ignorance and degradation. Such is the logic by which founding of colleges for educating colored people is made out to be an interference with the internal concerns of other states. What the newspaper was responding to is that they were angered about how the college would empower slaves and destroy the money of the southern planters. Now that logic only worked in New Haven because they depended on the money coming from those planters. You had the most southern students going to Yale University, and then you had Eli Whitney, who was making money off the cotton gin. You also had Newhall, who was making a lot of money in the South with his buggies that he was building. So there was an interdependence between commerce and economies between New Haven in particular and the South. The violence and backlash continued for years. William Lansing and Simeon Jocelyn bore the brunt of it. Simeon Jocelyn was removed as the leader of the black church in 1934. In Spireworth, the community that he and William Lansing found together was attacked in 1937. Jocelyn and Williams had to retreat from the spotlight and became more instrumental in the Underground Railroad. Williams continued to be persecuted in the city until he died poor. Jocelyn would later become instrumental in securing the freedom of the hostages aboard the Amistad. CT set the trend in forbidding blacks to be educated. They made laws that made it illegal to teach free blacks from a different state. When Prudence Crandall, with assistance from Simeon Jocelyn, opened its school to African hostages and freedmen, it also was met with a violent backlash, with armed white mobs attacking the school and its residents. The Yale elite also had the influence to have other northern states to create laws restricting the education of free blacks. They even made a concerted effort to prevent the Negro Convention from attempting to set up another college or school. Yale only permitted black people to audit classes, but they wouldn't let them enroll officially until 1875, after the Civil War was over. That is when they admitted Edward Boucher. The narrative of the dangerous, educated black man only validated the American Colonization Society. The biggest fear of having an educated black population is a fear of revolt and uprising. My question is, if you are afraid of that happening, why would you continue to oppress them? The first college to open for the black population was established 20 years after the Second Philadelphia Negro Convention. The school was Lincoln University, which is now the oldest HBCU, and also the school that John Huggins met Erica. Now that concludes my report on the history of education and the black population in New Haven. We see the effects of these past decisions in our city today. The white elites would have rather us in these current conditions than in a position for us to prosper. That is the only conclusion that I can come based off the facts that we're given. Now, join our Facebook group, Young Adults Learning Evil Podcast, and let's continue the discussion. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Peace.
Thank you for listening to Young Adults Learning Evil. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Visit our Patreon page and learn how you can support and stay in tune with the movement. Till next time, peace.